everyone. My name is Ramiro. I am a member of Anticonquista. I live in LA, but I'm back home in New York for the holidays. And today is episode 5 of Decolonizing Media. Decolonizing Media is dedicated to exposing capitalist and imperialist media that propagate lies about our people, our nations, and our movements. So thank you so much for following us. So far, we've only had about 4 episodes, and we have over 1,800 listens and watch on our video and our audio feed. So that's amazing. Thank you all for supporting us, continuing to listen to us, and I hope to keep hearing from you soon. So for today's episode, we're going to take a look at a video produced by a YouTube channel called The School of Life. The School of Life is addressing the issue of why some countries are poor and other countries are rich. The video argues that the reason why some countries are rich and others are poor depends on 3 main points. Number 1, the quality of their institutions. Number 2, their culture. And number 3, their geography. According to the video, poor countries in the third world are not as economically developed as first world countries because their institutions are inherently corrupt, whatever that means, because they're more religious, because they don't follow a meritocratic system, a meritocracy. Meritocracy is a system based on merit and achievement and not loyalty. And also because their locations are unfavorable for trade and growth. So those are the main arguments that the video puts forth as to why some countries are rich and some countries are poor. And I picked this video because unfortunately, I believe a lot of people, including Latin American and Caribbean people, our people, unfortunately buy into this view. They have a very self-hating view that any issues going on in the third world, in the global south, are our own fault. They think that it's our people are inherently corrupt. Our people are violent by nature, which I believe is incorrect. I have a lot of problems with this video and the arguments it puts forth. I'll go into my specific disagreements in a bit, but my issue with it overall is that it fails to address the main causes of global inequality, which we know are colonialism and capitalist imperialism as economic systems. Our people living in and descended from the global south, are constantly told it's our fault that our countries are impoverished. The hundreds of years of European and North American colonization and imperialism in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean are totally left out from the discussion. And the capitalist drive for profits taken through extraction in the global south are not mentioned either. There's a great author, activist, revolutionary. His name is Walter Rodney. He's Afro-Guyanese. He is the author of the book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. It's a great book, published 1972. I highly suggest you all read it. He basically shares my similar view on underdevelopment in the global south. And I just think that this video, the one we're about to play now, totally ignores the root cause of impoverishment in the global south. In his book, Rodney described how Africa had been exploited by European imperialists for centuries, leading directly to modern underdevelopment on most of the continent. I highly recommend reading it. It's great. And as I mentioned before, his perspective is very similar to mine in the sense that underdevelopment in the global south is the product of exploitation from Europe and North America. That being said, let's see what the School of Life has to say about why some countries are poor and other countries are rich.
There are 196 countries in the world. 25 of them are very rich, defined as having an average wealth per person of over $100,000 a year. They are. But far more countries are quite poor, and some, which we're considering here, are very, very poor. These are the 20 poorest countries in the world, where the per capita wealth is under $1,000 a year, or under $3 a day. Every country is now more or less on a path to growth, but the poor ones are growing very, very slowly.
So he says every country is on a path to growth. And he shows a line chart with different lines representing different regions and their GDP per capita. GDP stands for gross domestic product, which represents the total value of goods produced and services provided in a country during 1 year. And it's one of the many indicators used in economics to measure the health and stability of a country's economy. You'll notice that the mark representing the year 1870 is pivotal, is something changes in 1870. The GDP for the US and Western Europe goes up significantly, while the GDP for Latin America, Africa, and Asia remains extremely low. He makes it seem as if it's some mystery why this happens around this time period, 1870. But if we look back at history, we'll understand why. Remember that in the late 1800s, European powers like the United Kingdom, France, and Spain ruled more than half of the world through colonialism, stealing resources and land from the global south. Also remember that by the late 1800s, the United States was undergoing reconstruction following the Civil War and was becoming the preeminent imperialist power in the world, invading Latin America and the Caribbean and gaining momentum as the world hegemon.
If Zimbabwe continues at its current growth rate, it will qualify as a rich country in 2,722 years. What we want to know in this film is why some countries prosper and others stagnate, so that we can understand what rich countries are doing right and get a better grip on the challenges and hurdles facing poor countries.
So we can understand what rich countries are doing right, he says. What he actually means by doing right is stealing resources, land, and people from exploited global south countries. Let's remember that under global capitalism, capitalism being a system based on private property, profit, and private ownership over the means of production, the wealth of a minority of nations is built on the exploitation of the majority of nations. Wealth stolen from the global south creates wealth in the first world. The challenges and hurdles facing poor countries are rich nations.
There are basically three factors that determine whether a country will be rich or poor. The first is institutions. Institutions are beyond important. Broadly speaking, rich countries have good institutions and poor ones have very, very bad ones. The correlation between poverty and corruption is direct. The richest countries in the world are quite simply invariably also the least corrupt ones.
How can you have good institutions when the people of your country have been robbed and exploited for centuries? What do you expect? And it's interesting that in the list of countries that he includes as the least corrupt, he includes the United Kingdom. And in the country that he includes as the most corrupt, he includes Venezuela. Even though the United Kingdom has literally invaded a quarter of the planet, killed millions of people in the global south, and has extracted resources from the entire globe, and even enacted slavery across the globe. According to Columbia University economist Utsa Patniak, I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name, Utsa, my apologies. The United Kingdom has extracted a total of $45 trillion from India from 1765 to 1938. $45 trillion. Imagine that. Stolen from India. Are we really surprised that India is more underdeveloped than the UK? Understanding that the British have stolen resources like tea and copper and implemented sweatshops and textile mills in India and robbed those resources and taken them back to the UK. It's not surprising. So just keep that in mind when we're talking about inequality. Meanwhile, as I mentioned, he includes Venezuela as one of the most corrupt countries. When's the last time you heard of Venezuelan troops invading India or invading Iraq or Afghanistan? When's the last time you've heard of the Venezuelan army bombing cities or stealing resources in another country? Never. It's never happened. Yet in this video, he claims that Venezuela is corrupt and leaves the UK as one of the least corrupt countries. So another thing to keep in mind.
And the most corrupt countries are also the poorest. When countries are corrupt, they can't collect enough taxes to get the good institutions they would need to escape the poverty trap. Half of the wealth of the world's poorest 20 countries goes into offshore accounts. Lost revenues in these countries totals between $10 and $20 billion a year. Meanwhile, without an adequate tax base, poor countries can't invest in police, education, health, and transport.
Okay, 2 quick points here. First, most of these offshore tax havens that he's talking about are based in places like New York, London, and British colonies. According to a 2018 UK Land Registry study, there are over 6,000 properties owned by companies registered in the Global South based in London alone. In the UK as a whole, that number is 100,000. What happens is that wealthy, Western-educated people from the third world move their money to the first world in order to avoid having to pay taxes and fees in their home country, which fucks up their entire economy. Imagine if all the rich people in your small country, moved their money to UK and New York in order to avoid paying taxes, in order to avoid contributing to the national economy back home. That really takes a toll on your economy and your country's ability to succeed economically. So that's a major issue that is not addressed in the frame of, offshore tax havens in the UK. Second, he says many third world countries don't have an adequate tax base. Keep in mind that a large reason for that is because criminal organizations like the IMF and the World Bank force third world governments to lower taxes so that foreign multinationals can do business in those countries at a cheaper price. Look at what's happening in Argentina right now, where the IMF and the World Bank have been pushing Mauricio Macri, the right-wing president, to lower taxes, to cut institutions, to promote austerity in order for private companies to flourish. And so you can't talk about having an inadequate tax base without addressing the fact that this is done literally at gunpoint by the IMF and the World Bank in order to third world countries so that they lower their taxes and spend less on social programs. So the issues stemming from an inadequate tax base come from the financial regulations from the first world to begin with.
Now, a more generous way to look at corruption is that it's really a case of clan-based thinking. Say you're hiring someone. In the rich countries, you're meant to do so simply on merit, interviewing lots of candidates, then picking the best one, irrespective of any personal connection. But in poor countries, under the sway of clan-based thinking, that approach would itself be seen as corrupt. It's your duty to disregard the so-called best candidate from an anonymous bunch in order to pick someone from your own team, your uncle, your brother, your second cousin, the guys from the same tribe. As a result, poor countries don't allow themselves access to the intelligence and talent of the whole population.
Oh yeah, like that doesn't happen in the United States. What about Trump appointing Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump to key position? His daughter, Ivana or Ivanka, I can't remember. What about the fact that Trump appoints his direct relatives to key positions in the White House? What about the fact that all the leaders of the private companies that donated to Obama's campaign also got top positions in his administration? That's never talked about as nepotism or favoritism. They make it seem as if the United States actually follows a meritocratic system when it's based on capitalism and also personal relations with private companies and family. So don't tell me that's exclusive to the Global South.
There's a second thing that keeps countries poor: culture. What goes on in people's minds, their outlooks and beliefs. A striking statistic pops up here in relation to religion. If there's one generalization you can make about religion and wealth, it's that the less people believe, the richer they stand a chance of being. 19 of the richest countries in the world have 70% or more of their populations saying that religion is not at all important to them. The exception here is, unsurprisingly, the United States, which manages to combine great religiosity with huge wealth. More on that in a second. And conversely, the poorest nations in the world are also extremely believing ones. Here's how many people think religion and the supernatural is deeply important in the following countries. In the world's poorest country, simply everyone is a believer. Why is belief quite so bad for wealth creation? Because in general, religiosity is connected up with the idea that the here and now can't be improved, so you should focus on the spiritual and look forward to a next world instead. It makes quite a bit of sense when you live here. In the rich world, on the other hand, people are generally great believers in their capacity to alter their destiny through effort and talent. Incidentally, to explain the anomaly of the United States, religion seems not to slow down economic growth here because it's a particular sort of religion, an overwhelmingly Protestant and exceptionally materialistic kind. The American God doesn't want you to think of building the New Jerusalem in the next world. He wants it here and now in Kansas or Houston.
I'm an atheist. I don't believe in a God or religion, but I'm also a materialist. And being a materialist means that you understand that being determines consciousness. Now, what do I mean by that? The material conditions that people live in determines the thoughts and ideas they have of themselves, of their surroundings, and of the systems that they live under. In my opinion, people in the global south can be highly religious because the material conditions they live in are marked by poverty, hunger, violence, created by the capitalist imperialist first world. They turn to religion as a form of relief and escape from their material reality. Like Marx said, religion is the opium of the masses and the sigh of the oppressed. It's what people turn to when they're oppressed financially and materially. So it's not that religion creates oppression. Religion is a symptom of oppression under capitalism and imperialism. It's a response to the economic base of exploitation of the global south.
There's another big factor that determines the wealth and poverty of nations: geography. Poor countries are overwhelmingly located in the tropical regions. This isn't a coincidence. Life is, in many ways, simply far, far tougher there. The problems begin with agriculture. Tropical plants are generally a lot less packed with carbohydrates. Poor countries have worse soil too. Also, and perhaps surprisingly, a tropical climate can be disadvantageous to photosynthesis. Historically, a key determinant in the likelihood of societies growing rich was their possession of large domesticated animals, such as horses and oxen, which liberated a huge part of the workforce from having to plough by hand. But in tropical Africa, domesticated animals have throughout time been devastated by a further appalling scourge, the tsetse fly. This small fly, exclusively present in Africa because of its heat and humidity, knocks out animals on an enormous scale, making them sleepy or inactive, and has had a profound effect on the ability of Africans to develop technology, increase agricultural productivity, and amass wealth. It isn't just plants and animals that suffer in the tropics. In the middle latitudes, humans are open to a terrifying array of diseases, including 100% of low-income countries are affected by at least 5 tropical diseases simultaneously. The magical temperature, which has helped to make rich countries rich, is 16 degrees centigrade. However superficially unpleasant, that drop below 16 degrees as autumn starts to bite is quite literally a foundation stone of civilization.
First of all, I think it's really problematic and racist as fuck to imply that people in Africa are allegedly lazy or less productive because of the warmer climate and because of bugs. I just think that's nonsense. I think it's a bit of a stretch to say that living in warm tropical environments is a factor in underdevelopment. While things like bugs, disease, and temperature can definitely have an effect on productivity, it's not a determining factor. At the end of the day, it comes down to the economic structure of the country and how fucked over it's been by the first world. Think of it as soil. You can't grow flowers on soil that's been plowed incessantly, on soil that's been destroyed. How do you expect to grow a garden on soil that has been pillaged and totally ruined by other people? So that's kind of the way we can take a look at it, is use the example of soil and flowers and growing crops. You can't grow good, productive, healthy crops on destroyed soil.
Geography also encompasses transport, and poor countries are on the whole very badly connected. landlocked Bolivia and semi-landlocked Paraguay are the poorest nations in South America. Africa has only one major navigable river, the Nile, and hosts 15 landlocked nations, 11 of which have average incomes of $600 a year or less.
All of the problems he mentions here with transportation and access can all be solved with proper infrastructure. Look at the Soviet Union. Within 5 years, entire cities were built in remote parts of Siberia and developed into thriving areas because of inadequate infrastructure. Adequate infrastructure was placed in areas where they didn't exist, and entire cities were built through roads, railroads, buildings, etc. Being landlocked doesn't condemn you to being poor.
Not coincidentally, the poorest country in Asia, Afghanistan, is also landlocked. Then there's the matter of natural resources. Natural resources like oil or precious metals can be real trouble, and paradoxically, poor countries tend to have them in spades. These natural resources are what economists call intensifiers. They will help to make a country with good institutions richer, but one with bad institutions get even poorer, precipitating what's called the resources trap. So the Democratic Republic of the Congo is one of the world's most mineral-rich countries, holding most of the world's coltan, which every mobile phone has a bit of inside. But natural resource wealth helps elites to grab money without requiring the cooperation of the whole society. If the only way to grow wealthy is to assemble high-tech aero engines, for example, you're going to need your whole society to buy into the project. But if you just need to extract a few minerals, you can do so with a small labor force, some guns, and an airstrip long enough to ferry your loot out to market. The wealth from coltan keeps DRC armed rebels in guns and corrupts every level of society.
He talks about the resources trap. It's basically the idea that if you're a global south country with valuable natural resources and so-called corrupt institutions, power will be consolidated into the hands of a few despots who don't share their wealth with the majority of the population. This does happen in countries around the world, but what's left out of this situation and this explanation is the role of foreign corporations in producing that whole situation to begin with. Let's take Venezuela as an example. Before Hugo Chavez took power in 1999, most of Venezuela's oil was privatized and sold at cheap prices to rich companies in the first world, benefiting a small clique of white settler elites like President Carlos Andrés Pérez and Jaime Lushinsky, or Lusinchi, some European name. Carlos Andrés Pérez and Jaime were aligned with the West and made a lot of money cutting deals with foreign multinational companies for selling out their country, just plain and simple. They sold out their country. They sold the oil to private multinational companies at low prices, and the Venezuelan people didn't benefit from any of those profits. It was under their administrations that the poor masses revolted in what was known as the Caracazo, which took place in 1989. The people demanded that profits from oil be used to finance social programs in Venezuela. And that's exactly what Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution did in 1999 after taking state power, creating universal education, healthcare, and housing programs. So don't try to act like corruption is internal to global South countries. It's the result of first world exploitation. So that's pretty much it. To conclude, I just want to leave you with this. The main reason why some countries are rich and some countries are poor is because of the capitalist imperialist system that dominates the world today. For the past few hundred years, billions and billions of dollars worth of land, resources, and intellectual power have been extracted from Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, rendering those countries weak on a global scale. And unless we eliminate the profit motive that stands at the center of the capitalist economic system and that has served as the impetus of imperialism and colonialism, global inequality will continue to haunt our people. And if someday we are to have a global socialist revolution, it should be led by the exploited working class masses of the third world and should address the issues of reparations on day one. That's all for today. Thank you so much for listening and watching. This is episode 5 of Anticonquista, Decolonizing Media. Make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, IG at Anticonquista, youtube.com/Anticonquista to watch us on YouTube. And on behalf of Anticonquista, have a happy new year. I'm back in New York. I'm celebrating with my friends and family. As you can see, I have a little different setup here back home in New York. So thank you so much for following us, supporting us, and talk to you soon.